welcome to Human Monsters. So, at the time that I am recording this, it is Tuesday, May 28th, 2024. It was quite a weekend. As it turns out, some material in the previous episode, the case of Richard Byrd, had its origins in terms of research data in an episode of a podcast called Time Suck. My collaborator, Misdemeanor, heard the episode, made some basic notes, and decided to write a script about it. Had she listened to the episode all the way to the end, she would have found out that the episode's story was an April Fool's prank. She only assumed it was factual because she had known the host, Dan Cummins, and his staff to be well-researched and embodying the utmost in journalistic integrity. In other words, it was an honest mistake on her part. Unfortunately, that is not how many Time Suck listeners have interpreted it. Most Time Suck listeners are not trolls, but the ones who have been harassing me and Misdemeanor on social media the last few days are definitely trolls. They have accused me of being a plagiarist and a fraud. For one thing, it would be impossible for them to know that because they haven't had the time to listen to every single episode of Human Monsters, of which there are over 200. Some episodes exceed over 3 hours of listening time. Another thing is this. Though I am against plagiarism, it would make my job much easier since writing the scripts can be a very long and labor-intensive process. Having to write every piece of data in your own words, as I do, can be exhausting when you're writing lengthy documents. But that's what journalistic integrity is all about, and that's what I do. I've been told that I am an asshole for not apologizing to Dan Cummins directly. I wrote a Facebook group post expressing my regret that this all happened. That wasn't good enough for the trolls, the Time Suck trolls. They picked my apologia apart, saying I only apologized because I got caught and there was no humility in what I said. It's reflective of a significant change that has occurred in society over the last 15 years. Forgiveness is dead. We're living in the post-forgiveness age. Apologies carry no currency anymore, no matter how trivial the transgression, though they are demanded by many. Misdemeanor reached out to the staff of Time Suck, and everybody involved, including Mr. Cummins, is amused by the whole thing. In other words, they don't fucking care. Nevertheless, I sent an apologia via email to Mr. Cummins to make the trolls happy. It went like this. Dear Mr. Cummins, my name is Morgan Rector, and I am the producer, primary writer, and host of the Human Monsters True Crime podcast. My collaborator, Misdemeanor, used a recent episode of yours, Richard Byrd, as a research source. She didn't hear the episode all the way to the end, so she wasn't aware that it was an April Fool's prank. We have been accused by many of your listeners of plagiarism. I assure you, she only used the bare bones info on the case. Anyway, I've been chastised by some of your listeners for not apologizing to you directly, so here it is. I am sorry. It will never happen again. And people will say that that wasn't sincere and that it was glib, I'm sure. I have been told by your listeners that I am only apologizing because I got caught. I didn't know about the April Fool's prank factor until this weekend. Anyway, I hope you can accept this as an acknowledgement not only of my regret, but also of your talent as a storyteller. I hope your listeners will accept this apology because they have been harassing me and Misdemeanor constantly since the weekend. Our mental and physical health have been affected. Cheers, Morgan Erector. I likely won't receive a response since Mr. Cummins is a celebrity and likely too busy to read emails. Nevertheless, I sent it to him, and his staff can find it if it hasn't been lost in the shuffle. And yes, it is true that mine and misdemeanor's mental and physical health have been affected by all the harassment that has come our way via time-suck trolls. Misdemeanor was in tears. Dan Cummins isn't hurt or offended, but his show's trolls hurt two people deeply with their mean-spirited remarks. She published her phone number, and people have been calling her and emailing her cruel messages. I don't care what your reasoning is for all that. It's harassment, plain and simple. It's immoral and illegal. Your point has been made. Now, leave us alone. The trolls' lives must be empty and miserable for them to dedicate their time to such a thing. People with lives don't do that. If I heard this whole thing was happening involving another two podcasts, I wouldn't care. I truly wouldn't. In fact, I probably wouldn't even know about it. One more thing. I was plagiarized worse than Dan Cummins ever was. A guy ripped a bunch of my YouTube videos, edited out my name, and posted them on YouTube under his account handle. I wasn't even angry. I was flattered. The way I saw it, you wouldn't steal something if you considered it to be devoid of worth and merit. The time suck controversy was all based on a misunderstanding, though sadly, the time suck trolls will never accept or believe that. I'll leave you with this. Neither I nor misdemeanor will use time suck as an information source again. We won't even mention time suck or Dan Cummins again. Once again, I am sorry to Dan Cummins and his audience. And to the individual time suck troll, grow up, you fucking baby. Fuck you and fuck off. All my love, Morgan Rector. Now enjoy the show. Carroll Edward Eddie Cole was born on May 9th, 1938, in Sioux City, Iowa. He learned very little about his parents growing up. To quote Eddie, thinking about it, I know nothing about them, which is strange, or significant, however you see it. He did learn through the grapevine that his mother, Vesta, was apprehensive on her wedding night, but would have many liaisons with other men years later. He was also cognizant of the fact that his father dropped out of school after the 7th grade to go to work. Eventually, his father, Laverne, moved the family to Richmond, California, where positions in a large shipyard were vacant. During their time in Richmond, Laverne was drafted to serve in World War II. After years of wholesome Americana on the domestic front, Carroll's mother ushered in a new era in his life, a phase in which he would gradually lose his innocence. One day while playing outside, Carroll was called indoors by Vesta. The house was silent, with only himself and his mother occupying their home. His mother said to him, "Go get cleaned up, we're going visiting." He didn't know it at that very moment, but little Carroll's mother was oozing with sleaze, and it was bursting from the seams. As time would tell, that would happen in the most literal sense imaginable. Vesta led Carroll south on 5th to Cutting Boulevard, and then on to Point Richmond. Carroll found himself in a slum, complete with nearly derelict buildings and garbage everywhere. Vesta appeared to be familiar with these surroundings. She brought him into one building and up a flight of stairs. She knocked on a door and said to Carroll, "Whatever happens, don't you dare tell anyone. You understand?" She knocked again. The door was opened by a little girl about Carroll's age, who was naked except for a pair of panties. She is unwashed, with filth as her only wardrobe. A man appeared and pushed the little girl aside. He grabbed Vesta and she embraced him. They kissed. Their bodies converged, with him passing his hand down to her buttocks and caressing them. After the door was closed, Carroll counts 3 more couples in the living room. They are all soldiers. One couple is making out as a mother breastfeeds her baby. Carroll happens to look over at a bedroom door closing just as his mother disappears inside with the man who greeted her. A woman passes by. Carroll tugs on her skirt and asks for a glass of water. She takes him to the kitchen and places a glass of water in front of him. An elderly man pushed in a wheelchair by a middle-aged assistant suddenly appears. The man recently had a stroke and was making incoherent vocalizations. Carroll was disturbed by the man's appearance. Just then, Vesta and her paramour appeared, and they laugh at Carroll's reaction. Vesta was so amused she picked Carroll up and forced him to kiss the elderly man. She derived a sadistic pleasure out of subjecting him to this. After a moment, Vesta released Carroll and he went outside to play. The girl he first saw as he and Vesta entered the apartment followed him outdoors. She was now wearing a wrinkled dress, consistent with the uniform of neglect she had been sporting. If he expected to find himself making a new friend, he was soon disappointed. Taunting him, she said in a sing-song voice, "Carroll, oh, Carroll." Other children appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, and joined in the chorus. There was bullying to do, it seemed, and they couldn't resist joining in the fun. They would say, "Carroll is a girl's name. Carroll is a girl's name." It got to the point where they began to push him to and fro. Someone tripped him, and he fell to the ground. He felt so humiliated he began to cry. Enraged, he lashed out, punching and kicking whoever was most conveniently located. Vesta appeared amid all the commotion, with the soldiers following closely behind her. She was apoplectic and grabbed Carroll by the arm. Despite not having witnessed what happened, she said, "You started this. You're always starting trouble, damn you." Back of the house, Vesta whipped Carroll's bare buttocks with a belt while admonishing him for ruining her afternoon. She followed up by demanding once again that he keep quiet about the day's events, especially with the rest of the family. As she said to him, "You'll keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you." She also punished him in the form of forbidding him to leave the house for 7 days. His grandmother persuaded Vesta to parole him after 2 days. He may have been able to go outdoors, but his mother, a vindictive woman, was not done punishing him. For instance, he observed the smile on her face as he discovered she gave away all his toys to a neighbor's children. Over the next few months, Vesta would continue to drag Carroll to the dodgy part of town, where the same man pawed at her. Carroll did all he could to avoid the children who bullied him. Whenever they were home, Vesta would continue to threaten Carroll with dire consequences if he told anybody else in the family what a whore she was. She would even drive the point home with a smack. That bitch could never keep her legs closed for long, and sometimes at the apartment, the nameless man and his cretinous friends would join in with the abuse, smacking Carroll around. He was even put in a closet on at least one occasion. As if Vesta hadn't already done enough damage, she would psychologically torture him by forcing him to wear one of his sister's frilly dresses. As if it weren't bad enough that she gave him what the other kids called a girl's name, even if it was spelled in the masculine variation. It got worse. Vesta would invite other housewives from the neighborhood over for coffee, and it would be served by Carroll while he was wearing the dresses. On these occasions, she would refer to him as Mama's little girl. Carroll was deeply humiliated. He also began to experience sexual confusion. It was also the first time in his short life that he began to understand hatred and bitterness. Normally, when your mother is a cunt like her, it's enough to develop a mistrust of the female sex. She was really playing with fire now. There are no explanations for why Vesta took Carroll with her to the apartment where she unleashed her inner tramp. She had 2 other children that she left with neighbors, so why couldn't she have done the same with Carroll? She even kept him out of school an extra year so she could play this game. Enjoying her secret life as a filthy skank, she was turning her son into a monster. As she got fucked, she fucked him up. These experiences took a toll on Carroll, who would eventually choose his middle name to avoid bullying. He would have anybody who so much as had a modicum of respect for him to call him Eddie. Despite this, he began to withdraw. There was a large crawl space underneath their house, and he would retreat there as his misanthropic perspective on his fellow man began to take shape and poison his outlook. Sometimes when Vesta called to him while he was there, he would ignore her, and she wouldn't know where he was, so there was nothing she could do to him. He wasn't safe with her, but he was safe under there. When Laverne returned from the war, the Cole family's lives returned to normal. The slut no longer trundled off to the ghetto with Eddie in tow, and he was now enrolled in school. School was rough for Eddie. He started a year behind the other kids, and they bullied him for being different, as kids do. Not only was he taunted about his name, but a girl called him Cabbage Head because his mother often packed Brussels sprouts with his lunch. The name stuck straight through junior high and did nothing to allay his growing feelings of misogynistic rage. There was now a long history of being tormented by females, and eventually he would pay their abuse forward. It didn't help that when he attended Mass at Sunday school at a Catholic church, nuns would rap his knuckles with a ruler if his attention wandered. Even in church, women were abusing him. Eddie eventually took on a stance of zero tolerance when it came to bullies. If anybody stepped to him with a mouthful of shit, they were fed a knuckles sandwich. Any pain thrown his way was a boomerang, ensuring he would never suffer alone. Sex crept into Eddie's life one afternoon when he was using the bathroom and one of his brother's friends walked in without knocking. He locked the door and turned to Eddie. As Eddie recalled, I must have been 7 or 8 years old at the time. Nothing unusual happened, and I don't remember everything, but I was taught the act of masturbation, something that became an everyday affair for the remainder of my life. It was yet another incident that distorted his sexual identity, unsure as he was, if he may have had some homosexual inclinations. For after that, masturbation became an obsession for him. Vesta caught him once, and surprisingly, she didn't chastise him for it. They were both keeping sexual secrets for the other now. Wishing to take his sexual pursuits beyond the realm of the autoerotic, he was playing with a female cousin one day when he proposed playing doctor. He convinced her to remove her panties, whereupon he fondled and fingered her. Following this incident, He was plagued with remorse and felt that there was something wrong with him, and it would prevent him from becoming a man. Eddie yearned for a male role model who could guide him toward manhood. He turned to his father. One day Eddie got into a fight with neighborhood bullies, but lost because he was outnumbered. When he told his father took him back to where the bullies were assembled. He confronted a man who was a father to one of the boys. The man challenged Laverne to a fight, but Laverne turned the other cheek and brought him and Eddie home. The others laughed as they walked, feeling they were cowardly and saying so. This was deeply disappointing to Eddie as he reminisced. Our relationship wasn't much to speak of anyway, but it went downhill from there. Thinking about it today, I realized that incident wasn't the real problem, though. The real reason I had lost respect for Dad was that, even though I never told him, he should have known about my mother, exonerating me for not telling and punishing her for her domineering ways. To me, he just wasn't a man. My dad was always putting on a show of trying to be masterful, but when it came down to it, he always kowtowed to Mom. Oh, he would go full tilt when dealing with us kids. And the others could think what they would, but I knew the truth, and he knew I knew. Vesta continued to mete out the discipline to Eddie, while Laverne dished it out to the other two kids. Vesta never got her fill of tormenting Eddie. To quote Eddie, there was still a chance to work things out, until the incident that I feel was the most degrading thing of all. One day Eddie was playing with two neighbor kids, a boy and girl who were siblings. Eddie was wrestling with the girl when she managed to pin him. As a pièce de résistance, she lifted her skirt and flashed her panties at him. She grabbed his face with her thighs and pressed them tightly against it as she pushed her crotch against his face. He was both aroused and emasculated, and those feelings would continue to reach parity in the years to come. The girl was pulled off him by Vesta, who, in turn, struck his face. She hit him so hard he fell to the ground. When relatives showed up, Vesta was distracted enough that Eddie was able to escape to the space under the house. Meanwhile, Vesta's sister Gladys was arguing with Vesta because Vesta was winding up to hit Eddie again. Gladys offered to raise Eddie herself if Vesta truly despised him so much. A dog that belonged to the girl that sat on his face followed him to the crawl space. As Eddie was crying, he blacked out and strangled the dog. The next thing he knew, the dog was limp with its tongue hanging out. He dug a hole to bury it. It was then that a method of murder became crystallized in his mind. He climbed a tree afterwards to contemplate his actions. As Eddie put it, the real thought of revenge in strangling my mother, any woman, came to me right there while I was sitting in that tree. The act of strangulation as a method of killing was born after, and because of choking that pup. It was the most horrifying way of killing someone I could think of, later taking a different turn and becoming a sick obsession. Eddie would try another method of execution in his youth, drowning. One day when he, his friend Dwayne, and other friends went swimming, Eddie held Dwayne's head underwater until he was sure he was dead. To quote Eddie, I held him under till I knew that he was dead, and when I let him go, he sank. His other friends did not witness the murder, and the police did not investigate it as a homicide. From what they could tell, it was a simple drowning. what they would call death by misadventure. Did Eddie Cole feel some remorse or apprehension about this killing? Kinda. To quote Cole, when anyone would ask me if I wanted to go swimming at the harbor after that, I turned them down. No way. I was afraid of the police. With reason, as I thought. But there was no remorse about Dwayne. I hated him, and I was glad I stood up for myself. Dwayne was the latest to poke fun at Eddie about the name Carroll. So though he didn't deserve to be killed, he was playing with fire. Cole described the change that came over him after he became a murderer. If I thought my life was going to improve, I was sadly mistaken. Neither at home or at school, I was getting meaner and meaner, fighting all the time in a way to hurt or maim, and my thoughts were not the ideas of an innocent child, believe me. The next child to be targeted by Cole was Jimmy Whitney, a younger and smaller boy he played with on holidays and weekends. When asked why he wanted to kill Jimmy, Cole said, "No reason to speak of, but the thought of killing him entered my head." Eddie's family moved and he began attending a new school. His social life got a boost. He never told anybody his name was Carroll. He introduced himself as Eddie. He was getting better grades and his attendance improved. He was also doing well with ladies. Speaking about his feelings on this matter, he said, "I fantasized about finding some unsuspecting girl and killing her. I also prowled around Nichols Park by our house, acting like some kind of animal, seeking an unwary victim. Screwy, huh? Screwy indeed. Fortunately for the young ladies of the area, he never did find his prey when out for his evening walks." February 2nd, 1961. Eddie Cole had been on a collision course with disaster. He joined the Navy, but was dishonorably discharged. He was in and out of jobs. He was arrested several times, mostly for charges like driving without a license. This was a pattern he would repeat for several years in his adulthood until he went to prison finally for murder. He was a ne'er-do-well par excellence. He lost his virginity at the age of 18. Until then, he had had difficulty getting it up. What turned him on the most was the thought of strangling a woman to death. Realizing these urges were abnormal and morbid, he approached a police station to tell them about his disconcerting impulses. They recommended psychotherapy. He took their advice and checked himself into Napa State Hospital. He informed doctors he would stay for 90 days. He was adjudged a neurotic type who struggled with guilt, authority figures, and childlike, immature attitudes about sex. He was put on medication. However, he consistently lied to the doctors, so their perspective on his condition and personality should be taken with a grain of salt. Perhaps the doctors saw through his facade. For one, Dr. L.M. Jones said, "It was felt by some that he was a possible sexual psychopath, potentially dangerous to the community. Staff made a diagnosis of antisocial sociopathic personality disturbance on March 21st and recommended that he be discharged, not suitable, not mentally ill, and recommended that he apply for outside psychiatric treatment or voluntary admission to a Atascadero State Hospital because of his sadistic, abnormal sexual tendencies." He was not prescribed medication for his life back on the street. After moving to Reno, Nevada, and supporting himself by robbing gay men, he and two friends eventually moved to Sacramento, California, where the law caught up with him once again. At first, he served his time in prison, then in a psychiatric hospital. This is an excerpt from an evaluation a doctor conducted on Cole. The patient demonstrates very strong feelings of difference, detachment, apartness, and unrelatedness. He also describes very strong feelings of inadequate ego controls and inhibitions concerning thoughts, feelings, and behavior. Further, he indicates bizarre sensory perceptions compatible with a severe schizophrenic psychosis. While many of these declarations appear to be a function of a hysterical type suggestibility and imaginativeness, it would seem tenuous reality contact must be involved. The feelings of dissociation and depersonalization, which are reflected in the foregoing, strongly suggest a severe identity problem. In this connection, it may be noted that the Rorschach strongly suggests a confused sexual identification, an underlying difficulty in accepting the masculine role. He appears to be attempting to handle these conflicts by denial and reaction formation. An example of his tendency to handle sexuality by denial and also literally reversing it may be observed on the word association test, where his response to the stimulus word breast was back. The patient's medical history indicates that he has been preoccupied with an urge to kill and then rape. In his discussion with me, the patient indicated that he no longer had the urge, but was still bothered to some extent by the fantasy of it. One might speculate that the urge or fantasy stems from his sexual identity conflict and difficulty with acceptance of the male role and consequent perception of females as threatening. One might presume that he reacts to this threat with hostility and that the kill and rape imagery are expressions of his hostility. One notes that the sequence is not rape and then kill, but rather kill and then rape, suggesting that even under these conditions, that sex with a living female would be too threatening. The heart of this patient's problem appears to be severe conflicts centering around sexual identity and acceptance of dependency. He reacts to these tensions with impulsive acting out of hostile ego inflationary impulses and with feelings of depersonalization. His MMPI configuration indicates the presence of psychotic pressures. The projective data do not reflect such pressures. While evidence of dissembling and faulty test-taking attitude have made reconciliation of disparate data more difficult than usual, my conclusion is that psychotic mechanisms are operating in this patient. I suggest that the patient be referred for retesting after about 2 months so that comparisons may be made with present data in the hope of obtaining more definite conclusions. The preceding recommendations were ignored by the staff. Cole filed a writ of habeas corpus. Cole proved that he could suppress his violent urges, and he was transferred to a minimum security facility. However, one doctor pointed out that he was sociopathic rather than schizophrenic. Another factor of note was that Eddie Cole was deeply homophobic. Normally this info is not filed away, but it practically became Cole's trademark. To quote one report, the Atascadero records document the patient's upset at the numerous homosexual approaches on the wards there. This is common at that hospital, and a number of the patients undoubtedly have the same complaint, but rarely does it enter into the records of a patient. The fact it did here in this case shows that the homosexual threat was quite prominent. Obviously, the subject still has a great deal of difficulty in his sexual identification. He is threatened terribly by a homosexual approach, and he is incapable of assuming fully and completely the masculine role. The female figure is very threatening to him, and he wants to kill it, as he did the girl he thought had given him VD. He is hostile toward his mother, the prototype of all female figures. He dare not rape the woman in his obsessions. He must kill her first. The official diagnosis: schizophrenic reaction, chronic, undifferentiated type. Eventually, Cole returned to Richmond, California to live with his parents again after he was released from the psych ward. It's where he always went when his life crash landed back then. During his time there, he began following current events in the newspaper, and one development that caught his eye, in particular, concerned the crimes of the Boston Strangler. For a guy who had spent so much of his time fantasizing about strangling women, this was a no-brainer. Commenting on this, he said, "In Boston, someone they called the Boston Strangler was creating havoc, which stimulated me beyond description." He collected as many clippings as he could get his hands on. Inspired by what he was reading, he began prowling in local Nichols Park after sunset. In his words, like a creature from last night's Late Late Show. Eddie moved to Dallas, where his brother Richard and his wife Mary were living. One night, Eddie stalked a woman he had seen on the bus he was taking. He followed her for a while. He removed his belt, fashioning it into a noose in preparation. At one point, she stopped and turned around. She recognized him, saying, "Oh, it's you." Her lack of fear must have been an outcrop of what they call Texas friendly. She turned and continued walking. Eddie continued following her. This time he passed the belt in front of her face and pulled it against her neck. It didn't turn out as he had planned. The belt was too stiff to damage her windpipe, and she turned around, kicking and punching him. She put her fingers in his hair and pulled it, which was exceedingly painful. They wound up on the ground, wrestling and punching each other. She started screaming. He pulled the belt tighter, but he could not shut her up. A porch light was illuminated. A man announced to them that if they didn't keep the noise down, he would call the police. Panicking, Cole left the belt around the woman's neck, got up, and ran away. Cole stood in the darkness near an apartment building where the woman was headed. He saw the police responding to the call. They couldn't see him where he was standing in the dark, so he got away with this one. The story was covered in the newspaper the following day. The woman's name was Priscilla. He considered taking another swing at her, but he also realized how stupid that would be, since she would by then have become hypervigilant, so he gave up on the idea. The next night, Cole went to a bar and experienced the coincidence of his life. Priscilla happened to be on the premises. Cole didn't leave. He decided to stay there and wait for the police to show up and take him into custody. He had been arrested many times in his life and knew there were more detentions to come. To his surprise, Priscilla never did call the police. He was shaken nonetheless and drank his anxieties down. Serial killers often torture and kill animals, and after getting married to a woman named Billy while he lived in Texas, in Dallas, their cat had kittens. He strangled one kitten after another. His cover story with Billy was that they ran away. He also enjoyed strangling Billy during sex to the point where her eyes ended up bloodshot and her neck was bruised. As Eddie recalled, Choking her became a habit and a necessary stimulant for sex. Many times, in years to come, women would complain about this practice as it scared them. Of course, that only heightened my excitement. Billy was a prostitute, and one evening when she decided to bring her John home, Eddie grabbed a knife in the kitchen and cut Billy. He grabbed her daughter Lucinda by the hair and dragged her around the apartment. The police spotted Billy on the street, bleeding. They arrested Eddie after Billy told them what happened. She bailed him out the next day. She refused to press charges. Eddie Cole was identified by Priscilla when he appeared in a lineup. She pointed him out without hesitation. He spent 90 days in jail. Following this, Eddie Cole's most recent misadventure at this time was getting arrested for arson and being sentenced to 2 years. He served 16 months and returned to Billy upon release. Before long, he moved to Oklahoma for a fresh start, without Billy. Billy tracked Cole down in Oklahoma City, and their lives fell back into a familiar routine of turning tricks, heavy drinking, and domestic violence. Eventually, he would abandon her once again by moving to Tulsa. Eddie hitchhiked westward to the Ozarks in the company of 2 couples who brought him along as they partied. Eventually, he parted ways with them. One night, outside a cafe, Eddie spotted a staircase. It looked like there was a storeroom at the top. He had no place to stay and left a bar drunk at 2 a.m. He went up the stairs and discovered that what he thought was a storeroom was actually an apartment. He entered. A woman was sleeping. He walked gingerly into the place and got underneath her bed. Remarking on this state of affairs, Cole said, "I find myself crawling under the bed, lying there for some reason, and I remember my thoughts as those of some prowling animal seeking prey." Eventually he got out from underneath the bed and descended down upon the woman, grabbing her throat. She struggled with gurgling vocalizations as he choked her, flailing her legs around. The muscles in his hands and forearms began to cramp. He let her go for a moment so that he could be relieved of the pain in his hands. She screamed louder than he anticipated, given her diminutive size. She spilled out of the bed. Suddenly he heard the voices of children in another room. Witnesses. He raced to the door. Once on the street, Eddie found an unoccupied and unlocked car and hid inside. Witnesses saw him get in, and everybody's attention was directed toward him. There were too many of them for him to break free from their grasp, and they brought him to the police. Initially, Cole denied the attack, but in his words, "But then the girl came in, bleeding from the nose and barely able to speak. She pointed me out as the one who attacked her, and I admitted it." Cole went to prison again, and after living a rootless existence, moving from town to town, drifting from job to job, he ended up in San Diego, where he would dispatch someone to the grave for the second time in his life. Her name was Essie, and he strangled her to death after a night of drinking and carousing. He put her body in the trunk of his car before throwing her purse in a dumpster. He stole $100 from her purse, and he was on his way to a motel. There he spent the night with Essie, still in the trunk of his car. In the morning, he went out to his car and opened the trunk to see if he really did what he remembered doing. He was drunk at the time, so it seemed like a dream. It was understandable. Nope, she was dead. Her skin was pale and waxen. He reflected on how it made him feel to know he had killed her. How did I feel? The night before, I felt nothing, not elation, guilt, or any of the feelings thought to appease someone like me. Just cold nothing. In the morning, it was just the same, except for concern over what I should do with the body. He spent that day drinking at a bar and intermittently walking back to his car to have a look at Essie's body. The corpse was found by a boy riding his bicycle days later. He reported his finding to the sheriff. The coroner was unable to determine the cause of death due to a lack of evidence of foul play. He found the presence of alcohol in her system, but it wasn't toxic enough to hasten her demise. Though Eddie Cole was noted to have accompanied Essie from the bar in which she had been drinking, it didn't serve as evidence that he was responsible for the murder. Her death was publicized in a newspaper the following day. It mentioned that she had 6 children and about as many foster homes. In other words, somebody the community at large wouldn't lose sleep over. In other words, Eddie Cole would remain a free man for the time being. The next woman to meet her end at the vice-like grip of Eddie Cole's hands around her throat was named Wilma. One disappointing element of these strangulations was that the victim would often become incontinent, befouling the air in the vehicle once she lost control of her bowels. The next day he drove to a town by the Mexican border called San Isidro. When he found a spot that was sufficiently isolated, he pulled over and dug a hole to bury Wilma. It didn't take long for Eddie Cole to fall into a routine of meeting a woman at a bar, getting inebriated with her, bringing her to his car, and having sex with her. It got so he didn't even get the woman's name, or if he did, it was soon forgotten. That was the case with his next victim. The next day he was reclined in a motel room, masturbating to the woman's dead, naked body, wishing it were there with him. He took her corpse to San Isidro and dug her a shallow grave to match Essie and Wilma's. He picked up his next 2 victims in a Mexican restaurant. They were Latinas, and after getting to know them a little, they asked him for a ride. He volunteered to do so. Eddie brought them to San Isidro, where he proposed that they get inebriated together. While one of them was headed to a spot to relieve herself, he bludgeoned the other in the back of her head with a claw hammer, the telltale sign of impending death manifested as incontinence. When the other girl returned, she was surprised to find that her friend was absent. So it appeared was the man who brought her there. Suddenly, he grabbed her from behind and began to strangle her. He was quite drunk, so it was twice the work to do her in, but he put in the extra effort. He spent the next few hours contributing his 2 latest additions to his private cemetery. After another period of getting hired and fired and drifting in and out of relationships, Eddie was carousing with a girl named Merlene Hamer, nicknamed Teepee because of her Native American heritage. After a night of drinking, Eddie takes Merlene for a drive. She interpreted this as an assumption that formalities were in order. This wasn't so. She reflected in her statement, "You didn't have to bring me all the way out here. I would have fucked you anywhere." Eddie reached over to Teepee. She anticipated a kiss and closed her eyes. She sure didn't anticipate that he would wrap his hand around her throat. He strangled her unconscious. Whether it was due to the alcohol she imbibed or some other explanation, she didn't put up much of a fight. She began to tremble as oxygen was cut off from the pathways to her brain. Eddie turned to the back seat and brought forth a lamp that had belonged to Anne, his most recent girlfriend. He wrapped the 3-foot cord around TP's neck. The lamp was placed in her lap as he finished her off by using the cord as a ligature. After Eddie was assured of her death, he pulled over and disrobed her. He dragged her corpse away from the car and wiped it clean since she had soiled herself during her death throes. Once again, his necrophilic urges were extinguished by the stench of excrement. He placed her corpse into the trunk of the car. He drove through some wooden hills for a while until he found a suitable spot to dump the body, one that offered some concealment. He didn't have his shovel with him, so he covered her with a sleeping bag. August 9th, Merlene Hamer's body was found. The autopsy revealed strangulation as the official cause of death. Given the condition of her body at the time, it was determined that a sex crime had been committed. Financial gain was ruled out as a motive because her finger bore a $1,500 diamond ring. Eddie was in Las Vegas after another stretch in jail and getting hired and fired and resigning from jobs. One night, he is with a woman named Kathleen Joe. He lied to her about his job, a teenage daughter who didn't exist, and even his name, calling himself Pepper. Kathleen Joe had been dating a black bartender, and Eddie was racist, so naturally he was incensed by this. One night they were out on the street when she backed into a darkened corner to relieve herself. This action appalled and infuriated Cole. As she finished and rose to her feet, he put his hand around her throat. Her legs folded and he dropped her like she was a toy, like a rag doll. He said to her, "You want to show off what you've got? I'll help you, bitch." He tore her blouse open, the buttons shooting here and there like popping corn. He got a hold of her bra. She shouted, "No, Pepper, stop." He wrapped the bra around her neck and pulled it tightly. The elastic ate into her flesh. He pulled it with so much force he broke it in two. He fell backwards and Kathleen massaged her neck. She said, "For Christ's sake, Pepper." He decided to finish the job. He grabbed her by the neck and pushed her to the ground as he choked her with all his strength. They came face to face as he strangled her. He could smell the liquor on her breath. Suddenly her eyes bugged out as he squeezed the ghost right out of her. And with that, she was dead. He dragged her down an alleyway. He stripped her body nude and deposited it by some shrubbery. Like the other victims, she became incontinent as she was being strangled. He walked over to a puddle, soaked her blouse in it, and washed the feces from her body. Having finished with this act of post-mortem hygiene, he mounted her. He forced his cock into her still warm but arid vagina. Though he didn't derive as much satisfaction as he estimated in his darkest fantasies, he remained rock hard nonetheless, and came inside of her as elderly women played the slots and hit jackpots sporadically across the landscape of depravity known as Las Vegas. For Eddie Cole, it was a windfall in the sense that he felt Kathleen Joe deserved to be slaughtered for dating black men. He was tempted to fuck her a second time later that evening, but instead he discarded her clothing in several dumpsters. He took the $7 she had left in her purse and threw it in the dumpster with her clothes. In Oklahoma City, Eddie met a woman in a bar, and without even learning her name, he took her home and they had sex. Cole described what went down. Somewhere in the middle of our making love, the booze kicked in, or else my mind went blank. I can't say which. I've experienced blackouts before, drinking and afterward finding myself in strange surroundings, uncertain how I got there, Understand, I'm not making excuses for what went on. It's simply a fact. It was Thanksgiving, and he woke early that morning, not to the aroma of a roasting turkey, but to the foul stench of feces. He went to the kitchen, where he discovered a slab of meat on a skillet whose origins he could not recall. The woman was in the bathroom, reclining post-mortem as she marinated in her own blood and viscera. Both of her feet and her right arm had been severed. Her tongue hung out of her mouth. Her buttocks were bleeding like a stuck pig because a hunk of flesh had been cut out of one of the cheeks. Eddie then realized where he got the meat in the skillet. He returned to the kitchen. He found the feet and arm in the refrigerator. Commenting on this state of affairs, he said, "That day was something else." He had undergone butcher training in a vocational school, and he went to work on the corpse. He placed all the severed parts in garbage bags and cleaned up the blood and scattered viscera. Cole's next victim was named Bonnie Sue. She had quite the reputation. He was a magnet for trashy women. As he said of Bonnie Sue, in most of the bars, she was treated like the plague. Everybody knew her as a rowdy, foul-mouthed drunk and whore. He was working at an appliance store at the time. He had a key to the place and lied to Bonnie Sue when he told her he was the store's owner. After miming his way through phony paperwork, Bonnie became impatient. There was a party in her pants, and she was waiting for Eddie to RSVP. She led him to an apartment he stayed in on the premises. He referred to the evening's festivities in the bedroom as a night to end all screwing. At 2 a.m., Bonnie Sue called her husband. She promised to be home soon while she played with Eddie's cock. She reached down to the floor to pick up her bra. When she sat up, she suddenly found herself being strangled. Despite the unsteady motions of the waterbed, he choked her until he squeezed her soul straight out. There was a problem with the aftermath this time. The neighborhood was well populated and busy at all times. He didn't have the use of a car to transport the corpse. He carried her body to an alley and dropped her there. It was a cavalier way to rid himself of her remains, but there was no alternative. The coroner concluded that, based on her blood alcohol level, she died of alcohol poisoning, and that a John dropped her in the alley to avoid culpability for her death. Eddie Cole got away with murder yet again. Eddie brought a 50-year-old floozy named Marie back to his motel room. After bathing and foreplay, he tied a garrote around her neck and strangled her to death. Her death throes were like a vicarious orgasm for him. He decided against ravishing her dead body. He was too sickened by what he considered to be nothing but a cheap whore. The way he saw it, the only alternative for posterity when it came to Marie was the gutter, and he viewed her the same way he viewed all materials that made their way through the manholes and into the sewers of the world. This murder happened in Las Vegas. Vegas is a magnet for transients, and many women who die there live on post-mortem as Jane Does. And so it was for Marie at the time. Marie's picture was printed in the paper, and someone who knew her came forward and gave the police her name. She had a record of sex work, though she had either aged out of prostitution or she just hadn't gotten caught in years. A motel desk clerk and bartender described Eddie based on their brief interactions with him, but the description was so inaccurate that he was not suspected of being the culprit at the time, despite a police sketch artist's best rendering. Were investigators getting any closer to prosecuting Eddie Cole for the murders? He had been married to a woman named Diana, who he wound up killing. This is from a psychiatric evaluation of Cole, written by a case manager at a prison where he was incarcerated after a misdemeanor charge brought to light yet another one of his warrants. Cole has been legally married on at least 3 separate occasions. His third and most recent spouse was found dead on September 26, 1979, in a dwelling occupied by the couple. Her body was discovered in a closet, but was so badly decomposed that an official cause of death could not be established. An effort was made to charge Cole with the murder of his wife, but the charge could not be pursued due to the decomposition of the body and the lack of accumulated evidence. Diana's death was still attributed to alcohol poisoning, so he was off the hook for the time being. When he was released, he was given $100 and a bus ticket to Dallas. Eddie decided to stay in Tulsa for a while. During that time, he landed a construction job, though it didn't last long. Still, it enabled him to open and close bars. He was homeless, but as long as he had a bar and some pocket money, he didn't feel adrift. One night he met a woman named Dorothy King at a bar. She was in her 50s and had several drinks herself that evening. She proposed that they adjourn to her apartment for the evening, and Eddie took her up on her invitation. At Dorothy's apartment, she was still sloshed, so much so that when Eddie began to choke her, she put up no resistance. There was no fear or terror in her eyes. She was too waterlogged by booze for that. As he brought her over to the couch, he suddenly discovered that they had forgotten to shut the door leading to the outside hall. Another tenant passed by and took a quick, cursory glance inside. He didn't see enough to be able to discern what was happening. Commenting on what happened next, Cole said, "Returning to the couch, I started ripping off her clothes. The poor thing had no breasts at all. But what the hell?" He eventually brought her to her bedroom, where he cleaned her up between her legs, where she had shit herself post-mortem. He was so disgusted he vomited on the floor halfway through. Once he got her cleaned up, he mounted her and fucked her corpse as the opening stages of rigor mortis were developing, matching stiffness with stiffness. He slept next to her that night in the early hours of her eternal slumber. The next day, Eddie closed a bar and returned to Dorothy's apartment to sleep again. He enjoyed being with Dorothy. She didn't nag or criticize him. He could live out his necrophilic fantasies without judgment. He still hated her and looked down upon her, but she had no choice at that point but to accept him as he was, and he was content with that arrangement. Eddie Cole had been arrested and convicted for many crimes, but now it was different. Murder charges, 3 of them. He was charged with killing Catherine Bloom, Marie Cushman, and T.P. Hamer. Cole was informed he could serve 25 years to life if convicted. That didn't scare him. He said he could do it standing on his head. Soon after he was charged, his father died from a heart attack. Of this, Eddie said, "The family blamed me for his death, with the embarrassment and shame of my arrest. For all I know, they may be right." His mother had nothing to say. While Eddie Cole was in jail, he came to despise his fellow inmates. They all felt that it was okay for them to do cruel things to others, including innocent people, up to and including murder, but nobody had the right to retaliate. As Cole remarked, "The worst thing was that, in most respects, this was my attitude too. I got to thinking long and hard about my past life and the murders I committed. Wasn't I taking lives without any regard for the victims? None of the women I killed had ever hurt me personally. I came to see that my attitude was no better than the bullshit I despised in others." Because two of his victims were killed in Las Vegas, Nevada officials applied to have Cole extradited to Nevada to face his charges there. A district attorney advocated for the death penalty. Eddie Cole was also in favor of the death penalty. In fact, he invited one of the case's detectives to the jail where he was incarcerated and confessed to the murders of Catherine Bloom and Marie Cushman. Cole's attorney was opposed to this action and requested a psychiatric assessment at his next hearing. His lawyer would go on to resign from the case, and Cole opted to defend himself. The judge urged him to refrain from doing so and ordered yet another battery of psychiatric examinations. Still pleading for the death penalty as the final outcome of his conviction, Cole said, "I believe in capital punishment. I don't see where the prosecutor is going to come up with this stuff because there's nothing good about me." He received a sentence of life without parole for the murder of Catherine Bloom. He would go on to confess to a total of 9 murders. After both Eddie Cole and the prosecutor offered their pitches for why Cole was a menace to society and a suitable candidate for the death penalty, he was sentenced to die. Eddie Cole spoke with the press about his pending execution. He said, "Everything is in motion, and I'm not changing my mind. That's not to say I'm not scared. Don't get me wrong. I don't consider myself brave or courageous or noble. In my own way, even though I'm scared and nervous, I'm sort of at peace too. I just messed up my life so bad that I just don't care to go on." December 6th, 1985. Cole's final meal was Boston clam chowder, jumbo shrimp, tossed salad, French fries, and Valium. Anti-death penalty activists were protesting outside. One of their picket signs read, "Why do we kill people who kill to show that killing is wrong?" Carroll Jimmy Cole was executed via lethal injection at 2:10 a.m. that day. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.